Released right as Disney was entering another dark age, Treasure Planet got mixed reviews from critics and was the biggest flop the studio ever produced, with the possible exception of Mars Needs Moms. And seeing as Disney was not too thrilled with losing $79 million, they pulled the plug on all future plans to turn it into a franchise, leaving it as one of Disney's only movies to have no sequels or spin off material, and really being known only for the infamy of being Disney's biggest box office bomb. But it does have its defenders, with some saying that it's actually a pretty good movie that gets a bad rap for flopping at the box office. And today I'd like to throw in my 2 cents on this topic and explore whether it really is underappreciated or if it's better off forgotten. Now, obviously, I'll be mixing my personal opinions in here with objective thinking. So if you're looking for an entirely impartial video on this topic, this might not be the one for you, because my conclusion will in some part be determined by my personal feelings on it. And as per usual, there will be spoilers ahead for this movie, so you should probably click off the video and come back later if you don't want anything ruined. Alright, now for those of you who are still here, I guess a summary of this movie would probably be the best thing to go over first. Treasure Island in space. Now, obviously, it's a bit more complicated than that, but if any of you have ever read the book Treasure Island or seen one of its more faithful movie adaptations, you'll know that this movie actually follows it rather closely. And some people believe that's exactly why it flopped, because it combined classic literature with science fiction and a steampunk setting. And as a result, they felt it copied the book too closely for those who wanted to see more steampunk and was way too heavy on the science fiction for those who were coming to see an adaptation of the book. But personally, I don't think that was so much the problem. Sure, maybe that had something to do with it, but I don't think enough people take into account when this movie was actually released. Now, what a lot of people tend to forget about 2002 is it was a very big year for science fiction and fantasy movies. Think about it. In one year, there was Star Trek Nemesis, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, and The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. And people were particularly swept up with The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter because their earlier installments were released only the year before to massive critical acclaim. So when you really look at it, this already put Treasure Planet at a disadvantage. Because especially in the case of Harry Potter, it was quite obvious which one parents were more likely to take their kids to see. And when you take into account that 3 of these 4 movies, Star Trek, The Lord of the Rings, and Harry Potter, respectively, were released only a few weeks after Treasure Planet, it becomes even easier to see why audiences weren't flocking to see it. Now, some might try to counter this by saying that Lilo and Stitch was released the same year, and even though it was heavy on science fiction, it still managed to make Disney a rather large profit. Which is most definitely true, but there are 2 things to keep in mind here. The first is that it was more marketed to kids, and the science fiction elements weren't quite as prominent, but also that it didn't have nearly as much competition. Attack of the Clones had been released almost a month and a half prior, and all the other hyped movies wouldn't be coming out for another 6 months. And when you factor in that summer was just starting, there honestly couldn't have been a better time for it to be released, especially with it geared so much towards children. But getting back to Treasure Planet, I will admit that its overall premise might have been a bit off-putting for some of the general audience. And when you combine that with so many hyped movies being released right after it, it's quite obvious to see why people weren't exactly waiting out the door to get a chance to see it. But that still doesn't answer the question of whether or not it was a good movie and whether it would have done better had it been released at a more opportune time. Now, personally, I think that had it been released at a time more similar to Lilo and Stitch and not right before a bunch of highly anticipated movies, it just might have been able to make some decent money. Now, I'm not saying it would have broken records or anything like that, just that I don't think it would have flopped so hard. Because this is honestly a really creative science fiction movie. I mean, sure, its plot is based off Treasure Island, but the science fiction elements are completely original to this movie. I mean, the aliens, the ship, the crescent moon turning out to be a giant spaceport. In an age where everything has the same generic CGI look, many might be stunned to find how unique everything looks in this movie. It's almost like another Star Wars in that regard for how visually unique it is. And there's also the creative spins it takes on the book, such as the black hole incident or the reveal of the giant doorway and how Flint was able to steal from so many without ever being caught. I mean, nobody can accuse the people behind this movie of not putting in a massive amount of effort, both visually and writing wise. And then there's the characters. Now, personally, I've never been too fond of the rebellious teenage stereotype because more often than not, I feel it's not explored why they're rebellious and that they have absolutely no reason to be acting so self destructive. But not in this movie. Right from the start, it's clear that Jim is lost and has major issues because of his father's abandonment and is in desperate need of guidance from a father figure, which Delbert does try to fill, but ultimately doesn't succeed too well in, through no fault of his own, of course. I've always liked that scene, in fact, where he overhears his mother venting to Delbert about how she doesn't know what to do with him anymore, and that he has the potential to be great if he'd only just let himself. Because just by the look on his face, you can see that her words do genuinely mean something to him. He's genuinely sorry for causing pain to her. And these words, even later, partially inspire him to make the trip to Treasure Planet. As he says, this is my chance to make it up to you. And you can tell he wants to. In other words, I feel this movie does a great job of portraying him as troubled and rebellious, but in the end, actually nice, but with major issues to cope with. And on that topic, I also think his relationship with Silver is very well done. Particularly that scene during the music montage where Silver appears to leave him in a lawn boat, and suddenly Jim has a flashback to the day his father left, only for Silver to then appear again. I mean, tell me that doesn't pack a wall up, especially with people who can relate to that, unfortunately. But I also think that shows how much he's starting to look up to this man as everything his father wasn't, especially because he comes back. And another good scene that demonstrates this is when Silver is comforting him after the death of Mr. Arrow. At first, it seems like he's only doing it because he knows it wasn't actually his fault and so doesn't want him to feel guilty over it. But then it's clear it's about a lot more than that. And he goes on a whole speech about how he's destined for great things. And it's obvious he means every word of it. But the best part, in my opinion, is that after he's done, Jim just puts his head into his stomach and Silver seems to genuinely want to comfort him. Because I think that's the first time in the whole movie he completely lets his guard down. And it's to the man that just told him what he so desperately needed to hear and giving him everything he so desperately needs, the love of a father figure. And later, you get to see how their bond has become so deep that even after they turn into enemies, neither of them can still bring themselves to really hate the other. Like when Silver tells Jim he didn't mean what he said about him, you can tell he's telling the truth. Sure, his explanation is a bit awkward, but it still feels genuine, even if Jim himself doesn't buy it at the time. Seriously, Disney, this is how you make a bad guy sympathetic to the audience. You show progression. You show he's starting to come around. And the other characters are also pretty well done too. Delbert is hilarious. Captain Amelia is the perfect combination of feisty and sophisticated. Morph is cute, yet surprisingly helpful, and sometimes not so much. And Ben is great, both as a nuisance and as an unexpected ally. And Scrope is also very menacing and a terrifying threat that serves as the perfect fight for Jim once it's made clear that he's not going to defeat Silver in the conventional Disney way. So when you really look at it, though not exactly a masterpiece, I believe this is worth more merit than it's often given credit for. As a science fiction movie, it gets extremely creative, and it's got very good characters who all have their part to contribute in the plot. And at its very core, it's simply about a lost teenager finding a father figure in an unlikely pirate, who at the same time finds himself regaining his own soul through his love of the boy. And you have to admit, it tells that story pretty well, especially when you consider those elements weren't nearly as prominent in the book. Okay, before I wrap this up, I just have one more thing I'd like to contribute. And that's that I actually saw this movie when it came out in the movie theater. Now, at this point, I obviously don't remember much, but from the few things I do remember, I just know I was repeatedly amazed by what was being shown on screen. And that's no joke. It just doesn't have the same effect on a smaller screen than it did in the theater. But one thing I still remember vividly is the scene where Jim opens the map for the first time. And when they finally see it, Jim goes, Treasure Planet. And Delbert goes, No, in amazement before Jim says, That's Treasure Planet. Every time to this day I see that scene, it gets me excited. Whenever I hear the phrase call to adventure, I always think of that. So I guess my point here is, even if it's not the greatest movie ever made by Disney and was maybe even a bit flawed, I think most of you can admit that it definitely wasn't deserving of the distinction of being the biggest flop in Disney history, no matter which way you look at it. Alright, I think that's all I have to say on that. So now I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that Treasure Planet is better than most people give it credit for? Or do you believe it's not that good and the fact that it flopped is a major indicator of that? Please feel free to tell me in the comments. And remember, you don't have to agree with anything I said in this video. You can feel however you want about the movie, and I'm not going to hold it against you if you think differently about it than I do. Thank you all for watching. I really appreciate all your support, and I hope to see you all next time.